The Black Undercover Boss Big Shaq visits a diner, and everything seems normal until the waitress drops a bombshell. Her paycheck is docked for no reason. Big Shaq freezes the room with a look you don't challenge. He didn't come for fame, he came for justice. But when the truth spills out, the quiet giant knows the storm has only just begun. Before we deep dive into this interesting story, subscribe to our channel and tell us where are you watching from. Share in the comments below. The sun stood high over the dusty stretch of Highway 14, its heat glazing the road in a soft shimmer as the little town of Briar's Hollow dozed beneath the weight of forgotten time. At the edge of this map-dust town, flanked by a sagging general store and a tire shop that hadn't sold tires in a decade, stood a squat building with a crooked neon sign blinking diner in half-lit resignation. Inside, time moved slow like honey sliding down glass. The locals, mostly older white men in trucker hats and denim jackets, clustered in booths, carved with initials and ancient grievances. There were no welcome bells when the front door opened, just a quiet shift in air, a glance, a pause in chewing. He walked in tall and slow, shoulders wide like old oaks, dressed in a gray hoodie, loose jeans, and scuffed sneakers. Nothing flashy, no entourage, no gold chains or booming laughs. Just a man with the kind of presence that didn't ask for attention. It stole it in silence. Shaquille O'Neal, known to the world as Big Shaq, entered not as a sports legend or media giant, but as a quiet observer. His eyes scanned the room, not for autographs or applause, but for patterns, how people moved, how they looked away, and more importantly, who they avoided looking at entirely. The diner smelled of grease, brewed coffee, and cigarette ghosts. On the far side, a young waitress with a weary grace moved between tables. Her apron was stained, her shoes worn at the heels, and though she smiled at customers, her eyes were sharp with calculation. Shaq noticed how she lingered at one table, hesitated at another. He noticed how the busboy, a lanky man with caramel skin, kept his head down as if the floor itself judged him. The cashier, older, white, unsmiling, watched them both like a warden. Shaq took a seat at the corner booth, back to the wall like he'd done in his youth. From there he could see everything. The cracked linoleum floor, the way the waitstaff moved with caution, the pecking order disguised as routine. No one recognized him. Not here. The town was too small, too inward, and he was too dressed down, which was exactly how he wanted it. A coffee mug clinked onto his table. The waitress name tag read, Lena, gave him a quick glance. One not of curiosity but of routine. Need anything else? She asked without inflection. Shaq shook his head with a polite smile. This'll do. She nodded and left without waiting for more. It was enough. In that brief exchange, he caught something. Not fear exactly, but something close. Resignation. Maybe. A woman who'd learned not to expect fairness, who'd memorized which smiles got tips and which silences kept her from being called aggressive. There was no joy in her steps, only fatigue wrapped in habit. The conversation around him picked back up, low murmurs bouncing off greasy windows, and faded jukebox tunes. He listened. That's what he did best. Better than dunking, better than acting, better than anything TV had sold him as. Listening had always been his real superpower. And what he heard in Briar's Hollow wasn't loud, but it was there. A subtle disdain wrapped in jokes, comments about certain types not knowing their place. Laughter that dropped in pitch when Lena passed by. Words not meant for direct conflict, but for erosion. A slow chiseling away of dignity. There were no signs saying whites only. That wasn't how racism lived here. It breathed in the unspoken rules, in how shifts were assigned, in who got smiled at, and who got blamed when a plate was wrong. Shaq sipped his coffee and let it all unfold. Every small act, every glance, every silence. He wasn't here to play hero. Not yet. He was here because someone had told him this diner had a sickness. Not a corporate problem, not a customer complaint. Something deeper, something moral. And when his mother, Lucille, had raised him to use his strength, it wasn't just for rebounds. It was for standing tall where others were forced to kneel. The sun outside didn't know what was changing, but something was. Quietly, just like the giant in the corner booth, who had no intention of leaving until he understood why a woman like Lena smiled so little, and why the diner's laughter always seemed to come at someone's expense. The story had begun. And in Briar's Hollow, secrets didn't like to be watched. By the second day, Shaq had already mapped the rhythm of the diner. The same 6 men gathered each morning at the window booth. Early risers with thick accents and thicker opinions. They spoke in gruff tones about football and taxes, but their conversations always curved back to how things used to be. Their laughter had a sharp edge, and when Lena passed by, their eyes followed too long. Not with warmth but with entitlement. They were the unofficial gatekeepers of the place, and their presence shaped the tone for everyone else. Lena moved like someone who couldn't afford to break. She greeted with forced cheer, took orders quickly, and vanished into the kitchen as if the walls were safer than the floor. Her uniform was always clean, but faded at the seams. She wore a locket, its chain almost invisible beneath her collar, and every now and then, when she thought no one was watching, she touched it like it was a lifeline. But Shaq was watching, not out of curiosity, but because something in her posture told him more than her words ever would. She was carrying something heavy. In the back, the kitchen's pulse beat through clanging pans and murmured frustrations. Shaq had seen Jeb, the cook, barely speak above a whisper. A black man in his 50s with arms like carved wood and eyes like locked doors. Jeb kept his head down and his voice lower. He cooked without joy, without flair, just the way management liked it. The dishwashing station was manned by a teenager named Curtis, whose skin was too brown for the back room and too young for the tired in his bones. Every time someone snapped fingers for a refill, Curtis flinched like he'd lived this script before. Shaq noticed something else. The coded language. It never came out right, never marched across the floor waving flags. Instead, it slipped through in sarcastic remarks. That table's a little too urban. Or some folks just don't know work ethic. Management didn't correct it, they participated. The owner, Carl, was rarely visible, but when he passed through the diner, his words lingered like smoke. Jokes that weren't funny. Praise reserved only for the white staff. And Shaq noticed every second of it, his quiet gaze slowly stitching the pattern together. He started paying attention to the pay stub pile behind the counter. The white servers left smiling, tips in hand. Lena, Curtis, and Jeb always looked short of breath, and short of something else. There were no confrontations, no yelling. That was the design. This system wasn't about chaos. It was about control through calm, through silence, the perfect American lie. If it looks quiet, it must be fair. Shaq had made notes in his head, not on paper. He wasn't here to expose anything yet. He was here to understand. That meant watching how Carl's assistant, a thin-lipped woman named Sherry, handled mistakes. How she corrected Lena twice for being too sharp, in tone, when she asked for condiments. How she told Curtis to watch his posture. It was never about job performance. It was about reminding them who the space really belonged to. Outside the diner, the town carried on. Dust-covered trucks passed by. Kids biked without helmets, and church bells rang on time. No one would suspect the rust under the paint. But inside, Shaq was growing restless. He didn't show it. He just kept coming in, sometimes sitting near the kitchen, sometimes near the cash register, always watching, always listening. Lena began to notice him. Not because he talked much, he didn't, but because of the way he looked at her. Not like she was broken, not like she was invisible, but like he saw her and expected nothing from her. That kind of attention was rare in her world. One afternoon she dropped a napkin holder and muttered something under her breath. Shaq caught just enough to know it wasn't clumsiness. It was frustration at something deeper. That night, after closing, Shaq lingered outside. He watched Lena walk to her car alone. She stopped halfway, checked her phone, then sat on the hood for a full 10 minutes without moving. Her silence told him more than any scream would have. Something wasn't right, not just in her shift, but in her life. Inside the diner, the walls held secrets, but they were starting to crack. The grease in the kitchen didn't just coat surfaces, it coated truths. And under the grit of everyday operations, Shaq sensed the real engine behind this place. It wasn't food or service. It was power, carefully guarded, quietly enforced. He didn't need more proof, but he knew better than to act without knowing the full weight of what he was stepping into. That's when he decided to dig deeper. Not just into Lena's story, but into the history of this diner, into the system that protected smiles while breaking spirits. And as he watched the neon sign flicker again on his way out, Shaq felt it in his bones. Something was boiling. Something old. And it wasn't going to stay hidden much longer. Friday mornings carried a heavier silence in Briar's Hollow Diner, the kind that wrapped around conversations and muted the clink of silverware. Regulars showed up earlier, lingering longer, trading stories about the past as if time owed them something. Shaq sat in the far left booth this time. Same corner, but closer to the register. He sipped coffee without cream, and kept his phone off. This wasn't a day for distractions. It is a day for answers. Lena arrived 5 minutes before her shift, shoulders drawn inward like a house trying to protect itself from the wind. She walked past Shaq without looking, already bracing for the routine. Sherry, the assistant manager, stood behind the counter with a clipboard in one hand, and a smirk not quite hidden behind professionalism. A small white envelope slid across the counter with Lena's name scratched in thin black ink. Shaq watched as Lena opened the envelope, her fingers barely trembling. Her lips moved slightly as she counted the bills, then froze. A breath hitched. Her eyes didn't rise to meet Sherry's. She didn't say anything. She folded the envelope shut with slow precision and placed it in the front pocket of her apron. Shaq's gaze narrowed, and he leaned back just enough to blend into the booth's shadow. This wasn't the first short paycheck. He knew that. But today the number hit different. $32. Docked without warning, without cause, without explanation. It was too exact to be an accident, and too consistent to be coincidence. He listened closely as Lena stepped back from the counter and turned toward the kitchen. Sherry's voice followed her like a leash. That's just policy, hon. Short week, you know how it goes. Lena didn't turn around. She just nodded, as if nodding would protect her from the sting. Shaq heard another worker mutter, again, under his breath, but the voice disappeared behind the sizzle of eggs and the clatter of pans. No one protested. Not Jeb, not Curtis, and certainly not Lena. Shaq had spent enough years navigating boardrooms and media spin to know when someone was hiding behind jargon. Policy was the kind of word that got thrown around when fairness was too inconvenient. But this wasn't corporate oversight. This was targeted erosion. A system engineered to chip away at dignity in slow, silent ways. He flagged Curtis when the teen passed with a bus tray. "You ever get shorted?" Shaq asked quietly, almost casually. Curtis looked at him for a beat too long. Then he shrugged, eyes darting toward the counter. "I don't complain," he said. "Makes things worse." Shaq nodded. That was all he needed to hear. Lena moved mechanically through the morning shift. Her smile came slower, and the cracks showed at the corners. She poured coffee for the old-timers, who didn't tip. She cleaned a spill no one owned up to. And every time she passed by Sherry, her steps hesitated just slightly, as if anticipating a trap she couldn't see yet. By midday, the tension had become part of the diner's fabric. Even the regulars sensed something, but they didn't say anything. That was how things worked in places like this. You noticed, you moved on. You kept your plate clean, and your mouth cleaner. Shaq didn't. Instead, he stood from his booth and walked to the register. Just as Lena was clocking out for her break, Sherry looked up, her tone sweet but clipped. "Refill?" He shook his head. "I had a question about your payment policy." Her brows lifted. "Excuse me?" "I overheard something," he said, keeping his voice calm, unreadable, about shifts being shorted, deductions. Seemed strange. Her smile stiffened. "All legal. It's in the employee agreement. Nothing shady. But are the deductions consistent across all staff?" Sherry blinked, then leaned forward slightly, her voice lowering. "Sir, we appreciate you dining with us, but how we run things is internal business." Shaq nodded slowly, letting the moment stretch. He wasn't looking for a confession. He was looking for discomfort, and he found it in the way her hand tightened around the clipboard. "I used to manage teams too," he said smoothly. "Different industry. But we had a saying, if it can't stand daylight, it doesn't belong in the system." Sherry said nothing. He stepped back, thanked her, and returned to his booth. But the air had shifted. People were watching now. The regulars turned their heads slightly. The cook glanced out from the kitchen window. Lena stood frozen at the soda fountain, one hand on a tray, her eyes locked on the floor. And Shaq? He was more than just curious now. He was invested. He left a $100 bill on the table, not for the meal, but for the silence that had been purchased too many times in this place. Then he walked out, not fast, not slow, just steady. That evening, Lena sat in her car again, this time parked behind the diner in the gravel lot. Her phone buzzed, unread. Her locket lay open in her palm, a photo of a little girl inside, maybe 4 years old, smile missing a tooth. Lena stared at it until tears rimmed her lashes, but didn't fall. She didn't know who the tall man was, didn't know what he really wanted. But when he spoke up just once, it reminded her what it sounded like to be seen. Inside the diner, Sherry made a call to someone named Carl. "There was a guy here," she said. "Tall, quiet, asking too many questions." Carl's voice crackled through the phone speaker. "Handle it. Keep it normal. No drama." But nothing about this was normal anymore. The silence had cracked, and 32 missing dollars were about to cost a lot more than anyone in that diner could imagine. The break room wasn't much: bare walls, flickering light, a warped table with 3 plastic chairs, and a coffee pot that hadn't been cleaned since the Bush administration. But in a place like this, even silence had its corners. It was the only space not watched by customers, and the only room where employees exhaled without rehearsing. Shaq didn't go in there, not yet. He just lingered near the threshold during shifts, his ears tuned to low voices and offhand confessions that lived between breath and exhaustion. Lena was seated at the far edge of the table that afternoon, not eating, just staring into the steam of her coffee like it held answers she'd never been allowed to ask. The door was cracked open, and Shaq stood just beyond it, out of view, leaning against the hallway wall with arms folded and expression unreadable. He didn't mean to eavesdrop, but sometimes the truth needed an audience before it could find its voice. "I told him not to speak up," Lena muttered, almost to herself. "But he did. And now he's gone." Jeb, seated across from her, didn't lift his eyes from the sandwich in his lap. "Your brother?" She nodded slowly. "Dante. He used to do the overnight shift at Cal's Market." Heard the manager call another worker a lazy spook right to his face. Dante told him off. Didn't yell, just said it wasn't right. 2 days later, they're structured the whole night crew. Jeb grunted, not in surprise, but in recognition. "Ain't the first time, won't be the last." There was no outrage in the break room, only fatigue. Lena sipped her coffee again, fingers tight around the mug. "What kills me is how fast people moved on. Like it didn't matter. Like he didn't matter." Shaq listened, his thoughts already turning. These were the pieces he'd been waiting to hear. The fragments people tried not to say out loud, because naming injustice out here was like lighting a match in a dry forest. It didn't matter how small the spark. It always spread. "You ever think about leaving?" Lena asked softly. Jeb finally looked up. His eyes were calm, but worn. "Sure, every day. But I got my daughter's tuition to cover. And my mother's meds. They know that. That's why they keep me back here. No raise in 5 years. Not even a title change. Just do your job, keep your head down." There was a bitter laugh in his throat, but it never made it out. "I used to think hard work was enough," Lena whispered. Shaq didn't need to hear more. The weight in her voice told him the rest. This place wasn't just underpaying its staff, it was robbing them of hope in increments, so small, most didn't notice until they couldn't move. It wasn't just about $32 or crooked ledgers, it was about a system that made people believe they were lucky just to be tolerated. He walked away from the door quietly, giving them their privacy, his mind already cataloging what he'd heard. Every sentence was another stone in his pocket, not heavy on their own, but enough of them, and the weight became impossible to ignore. Later that day, Lena passed him on the way to table 9, her steps a little slower than usual. Shaq met her eyes briefly, just enough to show her he'd heard, even if she didn't know how, and for the first time, she didn't look away. Outside, the weather had turned gray. A soft drizzle coated the windows, blurring the world just enough to feel unreal. Inside, the diner remained lit with artificial warmth, pretending everything was as it should be. Carl still hadn't shown his face that week. Sherry managed everything with clipped tones and fake sweetness, doling out hours like favors, punishing with passive aggression. Curtis had stopped smiling. Jeb had stopped humming. And Lena had started drifting through her shift like a ghost, her locket now tucked deeper beneath her shirt. Shaq knew the next move wouldn't come from management. It would have to come from him. But timing was everything. He couldn't blow this open without the full picture. Not yet. That night, he stood outside the break room again, this time alone. The door was shut now, the voices gone, but the air still held the echoes of brothers pushed out, of cooks held back, of women learning silence for survival. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a folded napkin. On it he had scribbled notes, dates, names, amounts. It wasn't much, not yet, but it was enough to begin. The diner's walls weren't just coated in grease. They were soaked in stories, most of them buried under shame and fear. But Shaq had spent his life breaking through walls others said couldn't be moved. And now, as the neon flickered weakly through the rain, he decided tomorrow he'd start pressing deeper, because in the whispering corners of this place, truth had finally begun to speak. It was a quiet Tuesday when Shaq returned, a kind of overcast morning that dimmed the color of everything it touched. The diner was slower than usual, only half the tables filled, giving the staff a rare moment to breathe. Shaq used that lull the way a seasoned player used silence before a free throw, focused, steady, waiting for the opening. He noticed it during a routine moment, something most people wouldn't have clocked. Sherry stepped away from the office for just 3 minutes, leaving her keys on a hook near the supply rack. It was careless, habitual even. She wasn't used to being watched. And when she disappeared into the kitchen, probably to micromanage Lena's tray technique, Shaq moved. He didn't hurry. He didn't need to. A slow walk to the hallway, a left turn past the restroom, and he stood before the narrow employee lockers. They were beige, dented, and mostly unused. But the last one, number 8, was padlocked, even though everyone had claimed there was nothing of value inside. Shaq tested the handle. It rattled faintly. Then he looked down. The key hanging with Sherry's set had a tag on it. Locker. He made his move smooth and deliberate, sliding the key in, clicking the lock open, without hesitation. Inside was a folder. Nothing dramatic. No envelopes marked confidential. Just a navy blue binder tucked between some extra cleaning gloves and an old payroll calendar. He pulled it free, shut the locker, and took the binder to the maintenance closet across the hall. It was dark, narrow, and smelled like bleach and mildew. But it was private. He clicked the bulb overhead and flipped the binder open. What he saw stopped him cold. Handwritten entries, each dated, each with employee names, and adjusted totals, deductions marked as register variance, uniform damage, unscheduled break, or the most cryptic one, disciplinary doc. Page after page, the same names appeared most often. Lena, Curtis, Jeb. The deductions weren't small. 20 here, 32 there, sometimes as high as $65 in a single pay cycle. But what struck Shaq wasn't the amounts, it was the pattern. There were 2 columns, one for people like Lena, one for staff like Amanda, Brad, and Heather, the white servers who laughed loudly, joked with Carl, and never seemed stressed about rent. Their pages? Pristine. Not a single deduction logged. In fact, a few had bonuses noted, early shift favor, schedule loyalty, and the worst part, Sherry's initials next to every entry. A quiet endorsement of quiet theft. Shaq turned to the earliest date in the log. 3 years back. That's how long this had been going on. A whole system designed to look legitimate from the outside. Deductions dressed up in business language. But this wasn't bookkeeping. It was exploitation, and no one questioned it because it was masked as order. He snapped a photo of every page with his phone, careful not to bend or misplace anything. He knew how fragile cover-ups were. They didn't unravel from the top. They splintered when a single loose thread got pulled by the right hand. When he emerged from the closet, he found the hallway empty again. He returned the binder, relocked the locker, and rehung the keys, just as Sherry came around the corner, holding a stack of napkin packets. She gave him a thin smile, too busy to suspect a thing. Back in his booth, Shaq stirred his coffee but didn't drink it. He stared out the window, his mind racing. This wasn't just a diner problem. It was a culture problem. Carl, Sherry, they'd built an entire ecosystem that depended on invisibility. They relied on workers being too tired, too afraid, or too beaten down to resist. They counted on no one ever looking too closely. But now someone had. Later, after the lunch crowd thinned out, he caught Jeb taking a smoke break behind the dumpster. Shaq didn't say much, just stood beside him for a moment, before pulling out his phone and flashing one of the ledger photos. Jeb didn't react right away. He just took a long drag from his cigarette. Then he said, "You find that by accident?" "Sort of," Shaq replied. "Thought I was crazy," Jeb muttered. "Kept thinking maybe I really did clock in late. Maybe I really did forget a side order. But I didn't. Not every time." "You didn't," Shaq confirmed. Jeb nodded once, then crushed the cigarette under his heel. "They'll deny it." "They always do," Shaq said. "But denial don't hold up against evidence." Jeb didn't smile, but his stance shifted, just slightly. The weight on his shoulders didn't lift, but now he wasn't carrying it alone. As Shaq walked back inside, he passed by Lena near the back counter. She was rubbing her temple with the back of her hand, eyes tired. He paused, then placed a folded napkin in front of her. No words, just a small gesture. Inside was a single sentence written in pen. "You're not crazy, you're not alone." Her eyes met his. This time she didn't flinch. Carl hadn't been around all week, but Shaq knew that would change soon. Once someone realized the locker had been opened, the scramble would begin. But he wasn't worried. He had time, evidence, and something the others didn't. Leverage built from truth. This wasn't just about Lena anymore. This was about every person who'd been gaslit into silence. And as Shaq sat back down, watching the diner continue its mechanical motions, he knew the next move would come with pressure. Because now the system had been seen, and the shadows it had hidden behind, they were starting to fade. The next morning, the sky was bruised with streaks of gray, the kind of weather that made the world feel like it was holding its breath. Shaq arrived earlier than usual. The diner hadn't unlocked its doors yet, and condensation lined the windows like secrets trying to stay in. He sat in his car, engine off, fingers pressed lightly against the steering wheel. The ledger pages had been replaying in his mind all night. But it wasn't the numbers that kept him awake. It was Lena's silence, the years carved into Jeb's stillness, Curtis's learned flinches. And through it all, one name echoed louder than any other. Lucille. He could see her even now, standing in their small kitchen back in Newark. Apron dusted with flour, hands toughened by life but gentle with love. She'd raised him on resolve and responsibility, never letting his size be a reason to intimidate. Only to protect. She cried behind closed doors, always wiping her tears before coming out. But Shaq had seen enough to know that tears didn't make her weak. They made her human. Lucille had a rule: never walk past wrong like it ain't your business. Shaq hadn't always followed that. The world, for a while, convinced him to choose his battles. But something about this diner, this town, these people, it burned different. This wasn't just injustice. It was theft of dignity. Repeated and deliberate, under the guise of order. And Lena, with her eyes like locked windows, reminded him of women Lucille used to help at their church. Women with fire still in their hearts, even if life had spent years trying to drown it. When the diner finally opened, Shaq walked in not as a guest, not as a passive observer, but as a man stepping into legacy. He greeted Sherry with a nod, skipped the menu, and took his usual booth. He wasn't here for breakfast. He was here to finish what had been started the day he heard Lena's pay was shorted by $32. Lena noticed the change in him. She didn't ask questions, but something in her shifted too. She walked taller that day. Maybe she couldn't explain it, but some part of her recognized a man who wasn't just listening anymore. He was preparing to act. Shaq glanced around the room, noting the absence of Carl again. But he knew Carl wouldn't stay hidden much longer. Once the chain of command sensed a break in the system, the head always surfaced to check the damage. Shaq was counting on it. He spent the next few hours discreetly speaking with the staff, never accusing, never pushing, just listening, guiding, leaving space for them to share on their terms. He spoke with Curtis behind the counter during a slow spell. "You think they'll ever change?" the boy asked, arms folded tight like armor. "Change don't start from hope," Shaq said. "It starts when someone stops accepting what's handed to them." Curtis nodded, unsure. But that seed had been planted. Later in the break room, he found Lena sitting with her head bowed over her paycheck stub again. She looked up when he entered, her expression guarded. He didn't say anything at first. He pulled a chair, sat across from her, and reached into his jacket. From a worn leather wallet, he pulled out a photo crisp with age, edges soft. It was Lucille holding a young Shaq in her arms outside a brick apartment building, her eyes tired but full of a love that dared the world to test it. "My mother never had a title," he said, placing the photo gently on the table between them. "Never had a salary that matched her worth, but she taught me to pay attention. Taught me that silence is never neutral. It always sides with the powerful." Lena stared at the photo, then at Shaq. Something in her shifted again, not completely, but in. He told her about the ledger. The photos, the patterns. He didn't ask her to testify, didn't try to convince her of anything. He just laid out the truth, and let it sit, like a new weight waiting to be carried together. "I thought I was just tired," she whispered. "Thought maybe I'd forgotten how to fight." Shaq shook his head. "They've built a system that counts on you thinking that." A long pause filled the room. Then Lena closed her eyes and breathed in deep, like someone remembering how to inhale on her own terms. That day, Shaq didn't just see victims anymore. He saw survivors, resilient, scarred, steady, people who hadn't broken, only bent under pressure. He thought about Lucille's hands, how they were never idle, always doing something, always shaping something better, even when the world didn't give her the tools. And now he had her hands, her fire, her voice. This wasn't about being undercover anymore. It wasn't about just observing and reporting. It was about rebuilding a foundation others had tried to erode. As the sun emerged faintly through the cloud cover, casting a soft glow through the diner windows, Shaq stood by the counter and stared at the worn floor tiles beneath his feet. Each tile held footsteps of workers cheated, of customers complicit, of owners unbothered, and now of one man carrying a promise made to a mother long gone. He wasn't going to walk past wrong. Not now. Not ever. Thursday brought with it a restless humidity that clung to the skin, heavy with the promise of a storm. The morning had started like most others. Coffee brewing too slow, chairs screeching across cracked tiles, and Lena already 2 tables behind by the time the clock struck 10. But something in the air was off. A tension, thick and invisible, pulsed through the diner like a low, unspoken warning. Shaq felt it the moment he walked in. The smiles were tighter, the glances sharper. Carl was back. He'd arrived early, slipping into the back office without fanfare, but his presence was unmistakable. Conversations hushed when he passed. His laughter, dry and performative, echoed louder than necessary. The staff moved quicker when he was nearby. Posture straightened, eyes lowered. It was the kind of control no memo could teach. It was legacy, built on fear, reinforced by repetition. Shaq kept his spot at the booth by the window, pretending to scroll his phone while watching every movement. At exactly 11:47 a.m., the lights went out. Everything died in a heartbeat. The ceiling fans, the buzz of the soda machine, the old radio playing country classics. Even the neon sign out front sputtered into darkness. The silence that followed was unnerving. It wasn't just the absence of electricity. It was the sudden exposure, like a mask being yanked off. No receipt machine meant no documentation. No register display. Just old-fashioned guessing. And a sudden shift in balance. Customers murmured. A few got up to leave. Lena moved toward the counter, her voice calm but strained as she explained the situation. Then came the moment. Carl emerged from the back, his steps calculated, eyes already locked on Lena like a lion picking out the slowest in the herd. He didn't raise his voice. That wasn't his style. Instead, he addressed the room with theatrical concern. "Folks," he said, arms spread like a preacher. "Seems we've had a bit of a power situation. Bear with us." He turned to Lena then, voice cool but loaded. "You were on register last, right?" She paused, wary. "Yes, sir." "I rang out the field's table." Carl glanced at the drawer, opened now, but shadowed in the outage. "And you balanced it before the blackout?" "I was about to," Lena replied. "Controlled, careful." Carl's brows rose. "About to," he repeated. "Interesting." The crowd shifted. Sherry stepped forward from behind the kitchen door, holding her phone flashlight up like a spotlight. "Drawers short," she said flatly. "Looks like 100. Shaq sat forward. The setup was obvious. Too clean, too rehearsed. Lena's face remained stoic, but Shaq could see the tension building behind her eyes. "I didn't take anything," Lena said, her voice sharp now. "You know I didn't." Carl didn't accuse directly. He didn't have to. He let implication do the work. No cameras, no paper trail, just timing, huh? Lena turned slightly, scanning the faces of her coworkers. Curtis looked at his shoes. Jeb clenched his jaw, his hand tightening around the spatula he hadn't put down. No one moved. No one spoke. Except Shaq. He stood slowly, his height pulling every gaze toward him, like a magnet. The quiet in the room grew heavier. "Funny," he said, his voice low but steady. "How the drawer's never short when Amanda runs it, or when Brad's counting." Carl's expression didn't change, but the room did. Several heads turned now. Customers, staff, the kind of comment that couldn't be unspoken once it was said. Carl stepped toward Shaq, playing it cool. "You've got a lot of opinions for a customer." Shaq smiled slightly. "I've been here all week. I watch patterns." The accusation hung between them like smoke. Shaq didn't say Lena was being framed. He didn't have to. The structure of it was familiar. Chaos creates confusion. Confusion masks injustice. And when the lights go out, literal or metaphorical, it's always the same people accused first. Carl wasn't ready for pushback. He turned to the room again, regaining his composure. I just want to get to the truth, he said smoothly. That's all. Then start by checking Sherry's logs, Shaq replied. Might be surprised what comes up. Sherry stiffened. Carl's eyes darted toward her for just a fraction of a second. Just enough for Shaq to catch it. The moment held. Long enough for doubt to spread across the faces in the room. Long enough for Lena to step back from the counter. Eyes wide. Chest heaving not from guilt, but from relief. Someone had finally said it. The lights flickered once, then returned with a faint buzz. Power restored. But the illusion had already shattered. Carl cleared his throat, suddenly eager to redirect. All right, folks, back to business. But it wasn't business as usual anymore. Shaq returned to his seat. Lena moved slowly back to her station, hands trembling slightly, as she reached for a coffee pot. Curtis walked past and whispered, "Thank you," so softly it barely registered.
The play had been staged. But this time the audience had seen the strings. The performance didn't land. And as Carl disappeared back into his office, face tight with something that looked like fear in disguise, Shaq leaned back in his booth, eyes never leaving the door.
This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. By Friday morning, the air in the diner buzzed with a quiet discomfort. Everyone felt it. Conversations hung shorter, glances grew sharper, and Lena's movements were slower. Not from fatigue, but from the weight of being publicly accused and quietly vindicated all in the span of an hour. Shaq had returned, not for pancakes or coffee, but to finish what he started. The power may have come back, but the lights had stayed on in people's minds. Carl didn't hide anymore. He moved through the diner like a politician working a campaign trail. Smiling, patting shoulders, offering free pie to longtime customers. He made a show of carrying coffee pots and wiping down counters, presenting himself as the everyman business owner. But Shaq wasn't watching the performance. He was watching the spaces Carl avoided. And most of all, he was watching the back office. The door was always locked now. Before the confrontation, it had remained ajar. But today, it was sealed tight, only accessible with Carl's key. Shaq noted the increased caution. Carl had started to feel the walls lean in. Later that day, while Carl gave a speech near the register about donating to the local church's new youth program, Shaq slipped away into the back hallway, where a narrow security closet sat quietly behind a cracked mop bucket. The janitor's logs had shown something interesting. The power outage had coincided almost exactly with a regular cash pickup scheduled from the safe. That wasn't coincidence. It was cover. Shaq opened the closet door and scanned the wall. Mounted there was a narrow breaker box, and a small safe beneath a false cabinet panel. Not unusual. But what caught his eye was the old maintenance form pinned to the corkboard nearby. It listed the safe code 5 years old. Scribbled in haste, probably forgotten by now, or never thought worth hiding. Shaq memorized the digits, 4-7. He didn't touch the safe. Not yet. That wasn't part of the plan. He didn't need to open it to know what it represented. He already knew Carl kept cash off record. Skimmed from deductions that never made it to payroll systems. The ledger had only told half the story. This safe was the bank of silence. It held the hush money, the discrepancy gaps, the rounding errors that somehow always hit black and brown workers. Back at his booth, Shaq pulled up the church newsletter on his phone. There it was. Carl featured in a glossy photo, oversized check in hand, beaming beside the pastor. A $10,000 donation, in support of youth development and diversity outreach. Shaq's jaw clenched. Carl wasn't just exploiting people. He was laundering guilt into praise, building a community image on the backs of people like Lena, Jeb, and Curtis. It was classic manipulation. A facade of virtue, masking a machine of injustice. Shaq spent the rest of the afternoon weaving his plan together. He'd already collected testimonies off record. Curtis's voice on a memo app, Jeb's written notes, Lena's breakdown of her pay over the past 2 years. He'd scanned every page of the binder from Locker 8, and now had enough photographic proof to trigger an investigation. But an investigation wasn't enough. Shaq knew systems like this survived exposure. They rebranded replaced faces, made public apologies. He wasn't looking for damage control. He wanted disruption. Something they couldn't ignore. By evening, he made a quiet call to a contact in regional news. Someone who owed him a favor. Then another to a labor rights attorney he'd supported in Atlanta. He didn't reveal all the cards, just enough to set the wheels in motion. Outside, the town was gearing up for the weekend fair. Decorations were going up, families laughing in parking lots, and Carl's face smiled from a banner as a sponsor. Shaq watched from a distance, his eyes steeled. Carl had kept his hands clean for years by making sure no one looked too closely. He played the good old boy role, flawlessly, grinning for pastors, shaking hands with deputies, offering discounts to veterans. He knew the script. He'd written it himself. But Shaq wasn't from this town, and he hadn't come to play by its rules. That night, just before the diner closed, Shaq left a folded envelope under Carl's office door. No name, no signature. Inside were 5 photos, images from the ledger, snapshots of the safe, and a copy of the maintenance form with the old code. He didn't want Carl to panic. He wanted him to know someone was watching now, that the rules had changed. As Shaq walked to his car under the dim parking lot light, he felt the weight of it settle in. Not just the plan, but the promise. Lucille had taught him to never throw stones unless you were ready for the ripples. This wasn't just about catching Carl. This was about what came after, what got rebuilt in the ruins. Inside the diner, Carl retrieved the envelope and read it in silence. His face didn't move, but his hand tightened around the paper. His jaw locked. He looked toward the dining area, where Shaq had sat all week, and saw only an empty booth. The days of clean hands were over. The mask had slipped, and the storm was coming. The diner had never been louder. It was Saturday, just past noon, and every table was filled with a mix of locals, fairgoers in sun hats, and church families looking for post-sermon meals. The air smelled of grilled onions and overbrewed coffee, the energy buzzing with chatter and forks clinking against chipped plates. Shaq sat quietly in his usual booth by the window, the same spot he occupied all week. Yet today he felt different, not because of the crowd, but because of what he carried. In the crook of his arm was a leather portfolio, plain and unassuming. Inside, it held truth, hard, irrefutable, documented truth, and with it a change that could not be undone. Carl worked the floor like a man running for mayor. He made the rounds with a laugh just a notch too loud, backslaps a touch too firm, compliments a beat too rehearsed. He didn't notice Shaq at first, or maybe he did, and chose not to. Either way, he was about to lose control of the room he thought he owned. Shaq waited until the crowd hit its peak, when there was no table left empty, no seat untouched by curiosity, and then with the calm of a man who knew the moment was his, he stood up. The motion was slow, deliberate. Conversations quieted one by one as heads turned. Even Carl paused mid-sentence, his smile freezing in place when he saw Shaq rise, portfolio in hand, eyes locked on him. Shaq didn't shout. He didn't need to. His voice carried through the room like a stone skipping across still water, firm, clear, impossible to ignore. "For those of you who don't know me," he began, "my name is Shaquille O'Neal. I've been sitting in this booth for the past 10 days, observing, listening, and learning." A low murmur rippled through the crowd. A few jaws dropped. A woman near the counter gasped, clutching her phone like it might steady her. Carl's color drained from his face. "I came here under no press, no camera crew, no announcement, not as a celebrity, not as an athlete, just as a man who's been told there's something wrong with this place." He laid the portfolio on the counter near the register, opened it slowly, and pulled out several printed pages, copies of the ledger, annotated with highlights and dates. "This," Shaq continued, holding one of the pages aloft, "is a record of wage deductions, illegal ones. Over 3 years of documented manipulation, money taken from employees under the guise of policy, while certain others were left untouched." Carl tried to step forward. "Now hold on." Shaq didn't raise his voice, but he didn't let Carl speak either. "You've been running this place like a kingdom, Carl, and you've built it on fear, on silence, and on theft." He turned to face the crowd. "I bought the property next door last week, but this morning, I also finalized another deal, acquiring full rights to this building. As of today, I am the sole owner of the Briar's Hollow Diner." A collective gasp swept through the room. Carl stepped back as if struck. Sherry, standing behind the counter, fumbled with her phone, her face a frozen mask of disbelief. "I didn't just come here to observe," Shaq said, voice still calm. "I came to decide whether this place, this town deserved better. And I've seen enough to know it does. But only if it starts now." He turned toward Lena, who stood at the beverage station, her hands trembling, mouth slightly open in shock. Curtis peeked out from the kitchen. Jeb stepped forward, shoulders straight for the first time all week. Shaq faced Carl directly now. You're relieved of all responsibilities. Effective immediately. Any attempt to interfere will be handled legally. Carl's face flushed red, but he didn't speak. He knew the cameras were already coming out. Knew the crowd had turned. Knew the ledger wasn't hearsay. It was Shaq gestured to the documents. This information will be submitted to the Department of Labor by close of business. Back wages will be reviewed, and those affected will be contacted directly, including those no longer working here. No one clapped. The room was too stunned for applause. It wasn't a movie moment. It was real, heavy, and sharp with consequences. Shaq turned once more toward the staff. To those who stayed, who endured, who kept showing up, your time is no longer borrowed. Starting Monday, new contracts, real wages, transparency, respect. Lena's eyes welled, but she didn't let the tears fall. Jeb nodded once, solemn and proud. Curtis ducked back behind the wall, but the grin that escaped him didn't go unnoticed. Shaq closed the portfolio and tucked it under his arm. I didn't come here to save anyone, he said. I came to remind some folks that they were never powerless to begin with. With that, he turned and walked through the stunned silence of the room. The front door opened and shut behind him with a soft click, but the weight of what had just happened stayed thick in the air. Inside, Carl remained frozen in place. Outside, change had already begun. The day after Shaq's revelation, the diner was quiet, but not empty. The usual noise had faded into something else, something weightier. Patrons still came, but their voices stayed low, and their eyes often wandered toward the counter where Lena now stood. Apron neatly tied, posture straighter than ever before. No one knew what to expect. After everything, Shaq's announcement, Carl's exit, the papers laid bare on the counter. Something fundamental had shifted, but no one knew what would rise in its place. Lena didn't rush through her tasks that morning. She brewed coffee slowly, wiped down the same counter she'd been ordered to clean 1,000 times, and glanced at the booth where Shaq had sat. It was empty now, but it held his presence like an echo. There were no more ledgers in the dark. No more whispers ignored. But one silence remained. Hers. Until now. It was Jeb who broke the tension first. He stepped from behind the pass window, leaned on the counter, and looked at Lena not with expectation but with quiet encouragement. You gonna say what you need to say? He asked, his voice rough with age, and Miles walked in silence. Lena inhaled, slow and deliberate. Her hands gripped the edge of the counter, not for show, but for grounding. The few customers seated turned in their chairs without being asked. Curtis peeked from the kitchen, wiping his hands on his apron, and Sherry, no longer managing anything, only working the floor under strict oversight, froze mid-step. Lena didn't clear her throat. She didn't practice. She just began. When I started here 6 years ago, she said, her voice trembling but audible, I was grateful. That's what I kept telling myself. Grateful to have a job. Grateful they gave me a shot. Even when I got paid less. Even when I was called out in front of customers for things that weren't my fault. The room remained still. I told myself it was just how things were. That I had to work harder. Smile more. Stay quieter. I smiled when people said things they shouldn't. I apologized when I didn't do anything wrong. And when my check came up short, I bit my tongue. Her voice steadied. Because my daughter needed clothes. My brother needed help with rent. And I told myself if I complained, I'd lose everything. So I stayed. And I watched it happen to Jeb. To Curtis. Even to the ones who didn't last long enough to be remembered. Curtis stepped out into the open now. Arms folded. Head nodding slowly. I stayed silent, Lena continued, her eyes scanning the room, because I thought that's what survival meant. But silence doesn't protect you. It just makes it easier for them to pretend you're not hurting. She paused, breath shaky, but her gaze didn't waver. Carl told me once that if I wanted respect, I had to earn it. What he meant was, take what we give you and be thankful. But respect isn't a tip, it's a right. And I'm done being afraid of losing what never respected me to begin with. The last word landed hard. The room seemed to hold its breath. I'm not a thief. I never was. But I was treated like one, over and over, because they knew no one would listen to someone like me. Until someone did. She looked toward the door, where Shaq had walked out the day before, and that reminded me of something I forgot. My voice. Jeb straightened at the kitchen pass, clearing his throat. It ain't just your voice now. You got ours too. Curtis stepped forward, placing a hand briefly on her shoulder. Sherry remained motionless. the weight of her silence finally starting to settle in. From one of the booths, an older man, one of the regulars who used to laugh the loudest, set down his fork and looked at Lena with something that resembled shame. "I didn't know," he muttered. Lena turned to him, not unkind but firm. "You didn't ask." The truth hit like a soft hammer. No yelling, no dramatics, just facts, heavy and human. She wiped her hands on her apron and let out a breath she didn't know she'd been holding for 6 years. "I'm not just staying here to work. I'm staying here to lead. Not because I need to, but because I can. And because I won't let another girl stand where I stood, thinking she has to stay small just to keep a paycheck." The room didn't erupt. It didn't need to. The stillness that followed said everything. Respect had arrived, not with applause, but with acknowledgement. Lena's story had broken the spell, not just over the staff, but over the town. It made people see, and more importantly, it made them listen. She walked back behind the counter, picked up a coffee pot, and resumed pouring this time, not as a worker simply surviving, but as a woman reclaiming the space that had once tried to shrink her. And for the first time in that diner's history, every eye that followed her did so with respect. It began with a single camera crew, just one van parked across the street from the diner, with a tripod, a bored-looking reporter, and a producer who clearly thought it was a slow news day. But by noon, the sidewalk in front of Briar's Hollow Diner had transformed into a makeshift press zone. Microphones, live feeds, news anchors adjusting ties and lipstick in reflective van windows. Something real had cracked open in a quiet southern town, and the world was beginning to listen. Shaq didn't make a grand entrance. He walked out of the diner like any other morning, wearing a simple black t-shirt, jeans, and the same calm that had unnerved Carl more than any threat ever could. He stood before the cameras, his posture relaxed but his eyes sharp. Lena stood just behind him, flanked by Curtis, Jeb, and a few others who had chosen to show their faces, not as victims, but as voices. There were no cue cards, no press agents, just Shaq and the truth. "I didn't come here to be a headline," he began. "I came here to see why a woman's paycheck didn't match her hours. I stayed because what I found was deeper than a missing $32. It was a culture of silence, a system of small thefts that added up to something big." Cameras clicked. Reporters leaned in. "This wasn't a mistake," he continued. "It was a pattern, a calculated one. Employees of color were consistently docked, underpaid, and intimidated into silence. The management built a system that penalized dignity and rewarded obedience. That stops today." He held up a copy of the ledger, the same one he'd taken from Locker 8, now sealed in a clear folder. "This is evidence, not suspicion, not gossip, documentation. We've submitted it to the Department of Labor and multiple state agencies." One reporter from a major network raised a mic. "Mr. O'Neill, are you pressing criminal charges?" Shaq didn't flinch. "I'm not pressing anything. I'm funding a legal team. One that's not just for this diner, but for others like it." Gasps rippled through the crowd. Shaq nodded toward Lena. Because when she found her voice, others started listening. And now they're speaking too. The stories began to flood in that same afternoon. An anonymous former server, from a diner 2 towns over, posted a long thread on social media. A cook from a rural breakfast spot 3 counties away shared screenshots of altered timesheets. Each post was a drop in a growing wave. Within 48 hours, dozens of former employees across the region had come forward. Different places, same patterns. The kind of racism that wears a name tag and smiles while stealing. Shaq partnered with a legal nonprofit he had quietly supported for years. The organization announced a formal inquiry into small-town wage discrimination in the food service industry. Their hotline, previously quiet, lit up non-stop. Lena and Jeb gave statements. Curtis recorded a testimony for a documentary team. Even townsfolk who had once rolled their eyes now looked on with hesitant admiration, realizing that the man who'd once seemed out of place was now rewriting their history. Carl, meanwhile, had gone silent. His publicist issued a vague denial. A local radio host tried to spin it as miscommunication. But the evidence was too clean, too thorough. The safe, the ledger, the testimonies. Carl's charity donations, once his armor, now looked like hush money in disguise. And the church that once welcomed his oversized checks quietly removed his name from their website. The diner, under Shaq's interim ownership, didn't close. It stayed open, on purpose. Transparency became the new currency. A bulletin board listed all employee pay rates. Tip-sharing structures were posted beside the menu. Break logs were visible behind the counter. What had been a fortress of quiet control was now a glass house, and not a single window had shattered. Lena was promoted to floor manager. Her first act? Instituting a staff meeting policy, where concerns could be raised anonymously, but addressed publicly. Curtis was offered a scholarship fund, established by Shaq to pursue college or trade school. His choice. Jeb's hours were increased, and he was given training to become head of kitchen operation. But this wasn't just about fixing one place. It was about calling out a blueprint. Outside the diner, protest signs began appearing, not angry, but declarative. Fair pay is respect. Silence is not neutral. Dignity is not optional. The slogans weren't born in conference rooms. They came from handwritten notes, from napkins, from the mouths of people who had stayed quiet too long. A young woman named Deirdre, once a server at a diner in Pine Hollow, appeared on a national talk show recanting her experience being docked for attitude adjustments. Her voice cracked on air, but she kept going. Shaq watched the interview from a hotel room 2 states away, already meeting with another group of affected workers. He didn't smile, but his eyes held a fire that wouldn't fade. The storm had a name now. Not scandal, not controversy, justice. And it wasn't just sweeping through Briar's Hollow. It was reaching kitchens and break rooms and ledger books across state lines. Back at the diner, business had doubled, not because of spectacle, but because people came to see what change looked like. They brought their kids. They tipped heavier. They listened. One afternoon, a small girl pointed at Lena behind the counter and whispered to her mother, "That's the lady who stood up." And Lena, overhearing it, didn't cry. She just nodded and kept pouring coffee, like always. But this time, the pot never felt lighter. 3 months had passed since the morning Shaq stood in front of the diner and broke the silence that had governed Briar's Hollow for years. In that time, the building itself hadn't changed much. The sign out front still flickered when the wind hit it right. The paint along the awning still peeled in the corners. The bell above the door still rang with that faint metallic lilt. But inside everything was different. The name hadn't changed. That was Lena's choice. She'd said the name wasn't the problem. It was who had been allowed to speak beneath it. Now every corner of the diner whispered a different story. The counter had been refinished. The back office turned into an employee lounge. Pay scales were visible near the entry, printed cleanly and updated every quarter. Tips were pooled evenly. Sherry had left quietly after her contract expired. She was replaced by a young woman from a neighboring town, someone Lena herself had interviewed and trained. Carl had never returned, not to the building, not to the town. Lena now wore a manager's badge, that she hadn't asked for, but had earned. Her voice, once used only in the privacy of breakroom corners, now rang with quiet authority. She didn't shout. She didn't need to. Her presence alone was enough to maintain the new rhythm of the place. She still wore her locket, still touched it occasionally when no one was looking. But now the gesture wasn't a brace against weight. It was a reminder of strength. Curtis worked part-time now, splitting his hours between the diner and a community college. Shaq had helped fund through his foundation. He studied sociology, with plans to become a teacher. Jeb trained 2 new line cooks in the kitchen, passing on everything he'd learned from years of cooking in silence, now shared in voice. His laugh came easier these days, slower, deeper, and no longer hushed. The regulars still came in. Not all of them. Some had stopped showing up the day after the press conference, muttering about things changing too much. But others stayed, and they learned. A few even apologized, not publicly, not performatively, but quietly, sincerely. Lena accepted those words with grace, but never let them soften the facts. Change wasn't about comfort. It was about truth. One crisp morning in October, as sunlight poured through the windows with golden clarity, the bell over the door rang again, and in walked Shaq. He didn't announce himself. He didn't need to. His presence filled the room without fanfare. He wore a simple jacket, ball cap low over his eyes, and walked with the calm of someone returning to familiar ground. Lena looked up from the register, and for a moment everything around her blurred. She smiled, not wide, not for the crowd, but with something warmer. She came out from behind the counter, wiped her hands on her apron, and walked up to him. "You didn't call," she said softly. "Didn't want to cause a scene," Shaq replied with a grin. They stood there, not hugging, not shaking hands, just nodding. 2 people who had walked through fire and come out intact, scarred maybe, but standing. Shaq sat at his old booth, A fresh pot of coffee was already brewing, but Lena brought him the first pour herself. Around them the din of conversation resumed. People noticed him, of course. A few newcomers whispered. But no one swarmed. Not here, not anymore. He watched the staff work, watched Curtis teach a new hire how to refill the napkin caddy with efficiency, watched Jeb come out of the kitchen to check on a customer's allergy request, watched Lena delegate tasks with the ease of someone who had grown into her authority. "You proud?" she asked him later, sliding into the booth across from him for a quick break. Shaq stirred his coffee, then set the spoon down. "I didn't build this," he said. "You did. I just cleared the path." Lena looked around the diner. "Sometimes I still catch myself waiting for the other shoe to drop. Like maybe someone'll say it was all too much, too fast. That I should have kept my head down." Shaq leaned forward. "There's always someone saying that. Doesn't mean they're right." They sat in silence for a while, letting the comfort of the moment stretch. Outside, leaves swirled in the parking lot. A bus pulled up across the street, and a few teenagers wandered in for milkshakes and fries. Life moved on, but not without memory. As Shaq prepared to leave, he stood near the door and glanced back one last time. The diner didn't look like a battleground anymore. It looked like possibility. Not perfect, not without tension, but honest. He walked out without ceremony, the bell ringing once behind him. Lena watched him go, then turned back to the counter, just as a customer waved her over. She didn't pause, because the work wasn't done. It never really would be. But now, for the first time, it was hers to shape. And that was enough. If this story stirred something in you, don't let it stop at the credits. Speak up where silence is the norm. Tip with purpose. Question what's policy. Support the unseen heroes in your own town. The Lenas, the Jebs, the Curtises. Because real change doesn't come from waiting. It comes from walking in, just like Shaq did, and refusing to look away.